Tero Saranai from Venerable Nissarano here in Australia, I was going to say Western Australia, here in Victoria, not far from Melbourne, at Newbury Buddhist Monastery. And just as a little introduction, I'll just say what a year this has been, 2020, hasn't it, for everyone. It's been a year of uncertainty, a year of difficulties for many people. And of course, this uncertainty, this unreliableness, is part of anicca, or anitya, as we say in Sanskrit and in Sinhala. So now I've been in Australia for 1 year, been here for 1 year, but maybe after Vasa this year I will be able to visit Sri Lanka, come back to Sri Lanka. But we have to see what happens. These plans are only provisional, aren't they? And of course everything, as I mentioned, is unpredictable, unstable and unreliable. And we're getting a big teaching in this year. And today we're recording this desana on Christmas Day. And I've been asked to give a desana, a Dhamma desana, about tolerance and respect. Tolerance and respect. So I'd like to start with the Namo Tassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Namo Tassa Bhagavato Arahato Samma Sambuddhassa. Buddhang Dhammang Sanghang Namassami. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And now I'll begin with a gatha. This is not a very inspiring gatha, but when you hear the translation. Putu Sando Samajano Nabalo Kochi Manyata Sangasasmin Pijamanasmin Jnanang Bio Amanyang Amanyarang Parimutta Pandita Basa Vacha Gochara Bhanino Yavichanti Mukhayamang Yena Nita Natang Vidu. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. This is verses spoken by the Buddha, and I'll explain them in a minute. But the verses are quite a striking ones, and when you understand the context of the Lord Buddha speaking these words, you can appreciate them. When many voices shout at once, none considers himself a fool. Though the Sangha is being split, none thinks himself to be at fault. They have forgotten thoughtful speech. They talk obsessed by words alone. Uncurb their mouths, they yell at will. None knows what leads them to act so. So of course, I think people will be familiar with the dispute at Kosambi. This is where the Lord Buddha was, and a Vinaya dispute had arisen amongst the local monks, a dispute between the Vinaya teacher and the Dhamma teacher, which divided the community, and the community was arguing and wounding each other with verbal daggers, the the scriptures say. And so the Buddha addressed them, and I presume he was scolding them, but he had told them to stop this arguing, stop the wounding each other with these verbal daggers. But a monk said to the Buddha, the Lord Buddha, that he should abide in a pleasant abiding and not be concerned with this quarrel, and that they alone would be responsible for the results of this quarrel. And so pleasant abiding, of course, is usually associated with deep meditation, with the dhyanas. So the Lord Buddha left Kosambi, realizing there was nothing to be done there, and he recited these verses amongst, there's a few more verses about that appear in the Dhammapada, about he abused me, he beat me, he robbed me, those verses. So this is what the Buddha did, the Lord Buddha did. He realized he could not influence them at that stage. So what it points to is obviously a lot of division, arguments and division that we see in the world. We see it's everywhere. And it's natural, given our kilesa or our defilements, particularly ill will or aversion or anger, sometimes called in Sinhala dresha. And there are so many things that people divide over, argue over, and things like the coronavirus. We've seen so many different arguments about what to do, how should we deal with it. Does it actually exist? Even things like this. And conspiracy theories built around even the coronavirus. But of course the American elections were a very good example of this division, that can appear in society. And it always reminds me of the saying, divide and conquer. So it's a way people can gain power and keep it. And play off groups against each other is a common thing for politicians to do. And we see it in, as I say, the US elections. And people in Sri Lanka may think this is exactly what the British did. That's true. And there can be also a very negative focus sometimes, like intolerance towards minority groups. And these groups can become scapegoats, we call them in English, to build up power for the people who are using it in order to create a negative sense, often of unity in terms of nationalism. And we see that this is based on hate. And it's a good example was how Hitler used the Jewish people in Germany as scapegoats and blamed all the problems of Germany on these Jewish people, and therefore persecuted them and did the terrible things that he did. So this talk will look at the cause of this divisiveness, this intolerance, this disunity, and also what we can do. This is very important, what we can do in Dhamma. So the very obvious, isn't it, really, that the cause for all this division is really views which people have. Views that they're willing to die for in some cases, or attack other people and kill other people for. And one of these views that's very strong, it's the basis for what happened in Germany, was nationalism. And of course, pride in one's country is not a bad thing. It seems like quite a good thing. But when nationalism can be used to isolate groups within the community, then you can see you get problems, as I mentioned, in Germany, with the Jewish people being isolated, being seen as the problem. And these views, whatever these views are, the Buddha often talked about them as being wrong views. Views are very, very powerful, and they're very often very dangerous too. And I've given a couple of talks in recent months, 6 months really, about views, and in particular the view that there is nothing after death. But the Lord, as I mentioned, the Lord Buddha, he treats these views as wrong views. Why are they wrong? Because they don't lead to awakening. They don't lead to liberation. Because they're based on desire, aversion and delusion. We say in the Pali language, lobha, dosa and moha. And because of them, people develop a wrong Eightfold Path. So from these wrong views, they get wrong intentions, of getting, of hurting other people, of ill will, of aversion. They use speech that comes from that. So it's harsh, abusive, maybe false, divisive, and gossip. And from wrong speech, we get wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong action. Actually missed out that one. Wrong livelihood, wrong effort, wrong mindfulness, and wrong samadhi. So this is where wrong view takes us. Because sometimes people will think, well, these wrong views, no harm. But when they're acted upon, they can bring great harm and suffering. And one of the views that we hear, and we hear this in Sri Lanka, I've heard it a number of times, is that, we want to protect the Dhamma from being destroyed, like it was in India, in Indonesia, and in Malaysia. Sounds good, doesn't it? Sounds fine. But in what way are these people thinking of protecting the Dhamma? And often it's using fear, hatred, by using violence. Is this the right way to protect Dhamma? Is this Dhamma, in fact? And of course, anyone that knows the Buddha Dhamma knows that these are ad-dhammas. They're contrary to Dhamma. They're coming from wrong views, ditthis. They're coming from aversion, dosa, or dresha. And it brings up the question of how we can really protect the Dhamma. How can we protect the Dhamma? And of course the answer, everyone knows this, is by practicing it in accordance with the Dhamma, living by it. We have that saying, Dhamma nu Dhamma patipattiya. So this is practicing according to the Dhamma and not resorting to adhamma, violence, hate, etc. So how do we practice the Dhamma? I think everyone knows this. It's, of course, avoiding doing bad, doing good, or entering upon doing good, and purifying the mind. And of course, this is the teaching of all the Buddhas. And we're very familiar with that Gatha, the Sabba Papasa Karanang Kusalasa Upasampada, Sachita Pariyodapanang Etang Buddhana Sasanang. But that's the brief description. But of course, the Noble Eightfold Path is the path of practice, how we practice the Dhamma. And in this talk, I just wanted to focus on two aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path, because there's not that much time to deal with all the aspects of the Noble Eightfold Path. And these two are very crucial in this area where there is division and where there are tensions between communities. And these are areas we can develop, aspects we can develop of our practice. And they're right intention, or right motivation, Ajahn Brahm calls it right motivation, and also right speech. These are two crucial areas in these situations, because they treat the aversion, the ill will, we call it dosa or dresha in the mind. It's where we're coming from. And of course the things that we use, and I talk about some suttas very soon that deal with this. The Brahma Viharas, of course, the Maitri or Metta, Karuna, that's compassion, Mudita, this is joy with others, success or good qualities, and also equanimity, upekkha. These are the way that we can address these negativities in the mind, this ill will, this aversion. But also very important, and I think I want to play more, emphasise this more, but it will come up in one of the passages I quote very soon, that samagga, it's a Pali word samagga, but in Sinhala we have one very similar. I think it's samaggi, something like that. And what it means, it comes from the Pali, I was going to check it up, but samagga, what it means is harmony or unity, that we're all in this together. And this is a central aspect of the Buddha's teaching, actually. And so, when I read the next passage quoting the Buddha, it's emphasised in that. Other aspects that we can develop, besides the Brahma Viharas, besides samagga, harmony, unity, is khanti. Khanti is patience or tolerance. But this is, when we develop khanti, it cannot have this sense of aversion in it. Sometimes people grit their teeth and bear things, but their minds are very negative. But khanti, if it's real khanti, doesn't have this negativity in it. It's got a sense of loving kindness towards ourselves, at least. And the other aspect mentioned in the title for the talk too is respecting other people and accepting differences between people, because we know all beings, basically we share the same desire for love, loving kindness and happiness, friendliness. I always notice in the sutras, I like it actually, it's something that I've seen over and over again, how the Lord Buddha, he often talks about people as dear this or dear that. And some of these characters are very, we could say bad characters or unpleasant characters, but he still calls them dear. It's quite a nice thing that you see. So I'd like to continue where I left off, talking about the Kosambi Sutta, because in the Kosambi, disputing Kosambi, in another sutra by the Lord Buddha, Upakalesa Sutra, he talks about the dispute in Kosambi, and then afterwards how he went to visit Venerable Anuruddha and his two companions. And I'd like to quote a little bit from that, because it says so much about, how we heal division, how we bring this sense of harmony and unity, how we develop this sense of tolerance. And this and the next sutra that I mentioned will focus on that. And the Lord Buddha says, I hope, Anuruddha, that you are all living in concord, this is samaga, with mutual appreciation, without disputing, blending like milk and water, viewing each other with kindly eyes. Isn't that lovely? Blending like milk and water and viewing each other with kindly eyes. I think it's called Chaku Piya, something like that, Chaku Piya, very nice. And of course, Venerable Anuruddha answers that they're dwelling like this. But of course, the Buddha Lord Buddha doesn't leave it at that. He says, but Anuruddha, how do you live thus? Blending like milk and water. And he says, Venerable Sir, as to that, I think thus. It's a great gain for me. It's a great gain for me that I am living with such companions in the holy life. I maintain bodily acts of loving kindness towards these venerable ones, both openly and privately. I maintain verbal acts of loving kindness towards them, both openly and privately. I maintain mental acts of loving kindness towards them, both openly and privately. I consider, why should I not set aside what I wish to do and do what these venerable ones wish to do? Then I set aside what I wish to do and do what these venerable ones wish to do. We are different in body, Venerable Sir, but one in mind. Isn't that lovely? That's beautiful. It is very, it goes to the heart when you hear that, actually. And of course, the secret is, obviously the way they can live together is through this loving kindness, maitri or metta. But not only when they're together, that's in public, you'd say, but also when they're private, when they're back in their huts or when they're meditating in the forest, wherever they are. So this is the important thing, to develop it, and to develop it not only on the cushion. We often have the idea, metta meditation or loving kindness meditation, maitri, we do on the cushion. But of course, we have to do it through body, speech and mind, all three actually. The mind, doing it through the mind is good because we recondition ourselves, so we condition the mind, create the habit, the tendency for this loving kindness to come up and reduce the negative qualities of ill will or aversion within ourselves. But when we develop this in the mind, it has to come through our speech and through our actions. If it doesn't, there's something a bit strange going on. So this is an important aspect of it. And also we see when the Venerable Anuruddha mentions putting aside what he wishes to do in order to do what the other venerables wish to do, the other two monks. And that shows too a crucial aspect of a lot of the conflicts, a lot of the disunity and division come through this sense of self, what I want, what I need, and not thinking of the other person. And then, of course, he ends with, we are different in body, Venerable Sir, but one in mind. And that's lovely. And if a whole country can say that, that they're different in body, but one in unity. That's wonderful if they can do that. That's fairly ideal. So that's one sutra I'd like to mention. And the next one actually covers how we deal with removing resentment. And it covers some of the same ground, but it's a very comprehensive list that the Lord Buddha gives. And it's only a short sutra, so it's well worth contemplating. And this is called Removing Resentment. Removing Resentment. And it's from the numerical discourses, we call them the Anguttara Nikaya, in the Book of the Fives. And it's Sutra 161. That's number 1 of that. And here the Lord Buddha says, bhikkhus or monks, there are these 5 ways of removing resentment, by which a bhikkhu should entirely remove resentment when it has risen within himself towards anyone. I've added within himself, actually, because it's not obvious in the text, but I explain that. What 5? So these are the 5 methods for removing resentment. One should develop loving kindness or maitri within oneself or himself for the person one resents. In this way, one should remove the resentment towards that person. One should develop compassion within oneself for the person one resents. In this way, one should remove the resentment towards that person. One should develop equanimity within oneself. In this way, one should remove the resentment towards that person. So that's 3. There's the maitri, metta, and there's compassion, and the third one here, equanimity. So 3 of the Brahmaviharas. And then the next one's quite interesting. One should disregard the person one resents and pay no attention to them. In this way, one should remove the resentment towards that person. And number 5, one should apply the idea of ownership of karma or action to the person one resents. Thus, this venerable one is the owner of their karma, the heir of their karma. They have karma as their origin, karma as their relative, karma as their resort. They will be the heir of any karma they do, good or bad. In this way, one should remove the resentment towards that person. These are the 5 ways of removing resentment, by which a bhikkhu or a monk should entirely remove resentment towards a resentment when it has risen towards anyone. So I'd just like to make a comment there that, of course, this is a progressive list. It's very obvious that the first thing we use when we have resentment, anger, irritation, is to use metta, maitri. And who do we use it for? Ourselves. We're the one that is hurting. We're the ones that have got the negative emotion. I often say to people, the other person may not be upset at all, actually, and that can be the case. But if maitri doesn't work, if metta doesn't work, loving kindness doesn't work, then we can try compassion, karuna, seeing the suffering in ourselves, in other people, and then when we see that, when we develop that, we can forgive this other person. We can have this mind that understands all beings want to be free of suffering, and this person, in one way or another, is suffering. And also we have equanimity. Equanimity is a word in English that doesn't give much feeling to the emotion that it really is meant to convey. And that's that feeling of acceptance, but a positive feeling of acceptance. That oneself and others are like this at the moment, but this can change. It's not set in concrete. So that's the 3rd method that the Lord Buddha is talking about. The 4th is not paying attention. That's not a bad idea sometimes. Not because we find when we pay attention and we think of that person, what they said, what they did, we get angrier, we get more ill will, and we get more upset. So it's very skillful not to. And the reflection on karma is very important too, because this is actually often associated with upekkha or equanimity, that we can accept that this person, whatever they've done, they will get the results of it. I know often people can think, they can think that angrily, like wishing this person really suffer. And of course this is not equanimity, and of course that will give rise to negative karma in the mind. So I just wanted to point out with the loving kindness, the metta, that one needs to develop that loving kindness for oneself first, and when one does that, then it's possible to let go of this resentment towards the other person. I ask yourselves to think about, is it possible to develop loving kindness, maitri, for someone one resents? Is it possible? Pretty difficult, I think. But, and I think if this is the simile that comes to mind to describe this, developing loving kindness for a person one resents. And some people do try to do that, they may be happy and well, may be happy and well. But inside they're thinking, oh, well, I hope he isn't. But to me, this is like, we've got like scratching an itch on the leg when our head hurts. It's the wrong place. We're the ones hurting. The other person may not be hurting, may not be upset. They may be quite happy that we're upset, actually. And it's interesting, the commentary says, when a resentment has arisen in a bhikkhu in regard to some object, yata aramane, it should be completely dispelled there in these 5 ways. Where is there? That's what I wonder. And I think there is within us. Because that emotion, that negative emotion of ill will, resentment, anger, it's within us. It's not necessarily in the other person. So we're, as it were, treating the vyapada, this negativity, this aversion within ourselves, like a medicine for a sickness within oneself. And this is a very important way that we can remove or reduce the aversion, the vyapada. Here, the source, this is where it's coming from, within ourselves. And I liken this to scratching an itch on the head when in fact the head hurts. That's the right place to scratch. We're actually applying the remedy in the right place. So this is a very important thing. Otherwise we can end up with this sort of cosmetic maitri, metta, where we're wishing people that they may be well and happy, but we're not really in our hearts feeling that, actually. We may be wishing them quite the opposite. So this maitri, this metta, is this emotion of, we call it loving kindness, but I like friendliness, and I often like to think of it as regarding ourselves or contemplating the qualities of a best friend, developing the emotion of what a best friend is like, giving it to ourselves, and then radiating it to all others around us. We don't have to do that specifically, because sometimes if we think of a person that we're having trouble with, problems, difficulties, then when we think of them, it can derail that feeling of friendliness. So we just generally spread it, is often a good way of doing it. And it's looking for the good in people, looking for the what's right with people, not the things that are the faults. Because when we look for the good, then this breaks down these negative images we have of them. And of course it's the opposite of fault-finding, this loving kindness or maitri. And we can use it, as I said, we're using it here in this instance I'm talking about, to deal with the ill will that we're feeling. But we can use it for any of the emotions, difficult emotions or physical tiredness that we have. If we have tiredness or grumpiness, we can give it maitri to that emotion or that experience. And we can use it in the meditation, use it towards the body when we start the meditation, use it towards the present moment, and use it towards the breath. And when we do this, it really makes the breath, or whatever the object is, very beautiful. So this is how we can use loving kindness. And of course, as I mentioned before, we need to practice it by body, speech and mind, as mentioned in the sutra before, with that Venerable Anuruddha. So this is a very important way we can do it. But I mentioned too, and time is getting on, the right speech. And this is very important, because when there are divisions in the community, when there's one group against another group, it's the speech, whether it's written or whether it's spoken, sometimes it's visual, because these days on the internet you can hear people saying bad things about others, they write bad things about others, and they put videos up about others that put them in a very bad light. So when we're talking about wrong speech or abandoning wrong speech, creating right speech, this is very important in these situations. So I'll just read from the sutras. This is from the Kandaraka Sutra in the Majjhima Nikaya, number 51. So it gives you a sense of how important right speech is. It's where all the problems come from, actually, between people, between communities. So here we go. Abandoning false speech, one abstains from false speech. One speaks truth, adheres to truth, is trustworthy and reliable. One who is no deceiver of the world. That's very important, actually. People can rely on our speech. Abandoning malicious speech. One abstains from malicious speech. This is like talking badly about people. One does not repeat elsewhere what one has heard here in order to divide those people from these. Nor does one repeat to these people what one has heard elsewhere in order to divide these people from those. If you can follow that. Thus, one reunites those who are divided. One is a promoter of friendship who enjoys concord, harmony, samaga, rejoices in concord. I think it's samaga arama. Delights in concord, a speaker of the words that promote concord, samaga, harmony. Abandoning harsh speech, one abstains from harsh speech. One speaks such words that are gentle, pleasing to the ear, and lovable as to go to the heart, that are courteous, desired by many, and agreeable to many. Abandoning gossip, they abstain from gossip. One speaks at the right time. One speaks what is fact. One speaks what is good. One speaks on the Dhamma and the discipline. At the right time, one speaks such words that are worthy of recording, reasonable, moderate, and beneficial. Wonderful, isn't it? That's lovely. And so they're very important aspects when we get these divisions, whether, as I said, they're on the internet, on the television, they're in the newspapers, wherever we find them. First, that we abstain from false speech, we stick to the truth. And we abstain from malicious speech, and which slanders other people, and divisive speech, trying to divide people. This is what's the essence of the heart of the matter, is this divisive speech. And instead we promote this speech which brings people together, it reunites people, it promotes friendship, and it brings concord or harmony, rejoices, and the person rejoices in this harmony, delights in it. And harsh speech we abandon too. And it's interesting too, because gossip is, sometimes people think there's no harm in gossip really, but there is actually, can be a lot of harm from gossip. So these are areas that I just like to emphasize, this right intention, samma sankappa, and also right speech, samma vaca. These are very important in these situations when there's division. And this is our contribution can be to come from a good intention, from right intention or right motivation, and use right speech, not inflame the situation. So I wish everybody well in practicing the Noble Eightfold Path, and particularly these two aspects of it, so that we can be a contribution to the society we live in, whether it be Sri Lanka, wherever, and we can bring unity, we can bring this harmony, samaga, into the society we find ourselves, and we can, by our example, calm things down, at least not contribute to them getting worse. So this is a very important thing. And also to keep in mind that, I know I've seen this before, some people get very upset when they hear a lot of these negative things being said about other people, Muslims for example, and they really get upset with it. And it's not good if we get negative about what other people are doing. But we can, by our example, calm things down. So this is very useful. So I'd like to wish everyone watching a very good 2021. May it be better than this year, 2020. It may be a peaceful year, and a year when we can progress physically, materially, as well as spiritually. Very important spiritually, because where we're coming from will determine whether there's harmony, whether there's unity in our society. It's where we're coming from. This is so important. So I'd like to give a short blessing for 2021, and I'll just chant that blessing to finish off. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Sakkatva buddha ratanang osadang uttamang varang hitang deva manusanang buddha tejena sotina nasantu pandava samme dukkha vupasamintu te. Sakkatva dhamma ratanang osadang uttamang varang parila upasamanang dhammate jena sotina nasantu pandava sambe bhaya vupasamintu te. Sakkatva sangaratanang osadang uttamang varang ahunayang pahunayang dhammate jena sotina nasantu pandava sambe roga vupasamintu te. Yang kinchi ratanang loke vijjati vividha putu ratanang buddha samang nati tasma soti bhavantu te. Yang kinchi ratanang loke vijjati vividha putu ratanang dhamma samang nati tasma soti bhavantu te. Yang kinchi ratanang loke vijjati vividha putu ratanang sangha samang nati tasma soti bhavantu te. Nati me saranang anyang buddha me saranang varang etena sachavajena hotu te jaya mangalam. Nati me saranang anyang dhammo me saranang varang etena sachavajena hotu te jaya mangalam. Nati me saranang anyang sangho me saranang varang etena sachavajena hotu te jaya mangalam. May you abide in well-being, in freedom from affliction, in freedom from hostility, in freedom from ill will, in freedom from anxiety, and may you maintain well-being in yourselves. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And thank you to all who are watching this and to those that have made this possible, particularly Venerable Santa, Ayya Santa, one of the nuns here at Newbury Buddhist Monastery. And we have a community here watching or listening to this talk here on Christmas Day 2020. So all the best to you from Venerable Nissarano from Australia.